Good morning, Metalheads Internet. Welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown, and today we're looking at a brand new studio album from Temple of Void entitled The World That Was. I've recently noticed that we weirdly haven't talked about a lot of death metal so far on the Metal Meltdown in 2020, at least not in an official capacity, such as a full album review for any individual record. Not really sure why. It's not like there's been a lack of really interesting material. In fact, you guys have sent me quite a few albums in the last couple of months that you are already calling Album of the Year contenders. Take, for instance, recent records from Invictus, Plague, and Xenobiotic. I swear to God, at least one person every day is messaging me about at least one of these records. I've also been really intrigued by the debut album from White Stones, this kind of weird, cosmic, avant-garde death metal featuring members of Opeth. And I've also recently enjoyed Sacraments of Dissension from Perdition Temple, a band some of you may remember having opened for Cannibal Corpse and Thy Art Is Murder on their last tour. And then there's the new Solothus record, an album I have yet to even listen to in its entirety, but people are going fucking gaga over this thing. And yet, despite all of this greatness, this hype, this buzz, as I said, we have failed to formally talk about any of these albums. We've talked about some of them in some Albums I Missed videos, but that's about it. A part of me even wants to apologize for almost outright ignoring death metal so far in 2020, but thankfully, another part of me swooped in just in time and said, wait! It's okay, because there's one album that you need to talk about, and all will be forgiven if you talk about this specific album. That album being The World That Was, the third studio album from this group, Temple of Void. Of all of the death metal we just name-dropped, of all of the death metal released so far in 2020, this is the one I've heard the most about, and frankly, it's the one I've been the most excited for. Their previous records have been well-written and well-performed, hearty slabs of death doom, but their sophomore album in particular, Lords of War, had some interesting outside influences that hinted at a much more experimental, melodramatic, and ambitious path for Temple of Void going forward. All of that now realized on this record, The World That Was, to the point where simply calling this a death doom record, simply calling this a death metal record, doesn't really feel fair to Temple of Void. Now granted, this is still very much at the core a death doom record. It's not as if Temple of Void have gone off and made a fucking pop record or something, but there are a lot of unorthodox influences here from the worlds of alternative metal, from the worlds of progressive metal, from the worlds of melodic death metal, from the worlds of gothic metal, from the worlds of post-metal, from a wide range of bands including Asphyx, Morbid Angel, Paradise Lost, the Melvins, Alice in Chains, even the gods of metal themselves, Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden in some subtle aspects, making for an album that is every bit as brutal and sonically heavy as it is emotionally and atmospherically complex, with vocal harmonies, angular patterns, oddly anthemic, enchanting hooks with weird vocal harmonies. What's most special about this, though, is that all of this becomes so evident so quickly without feeling overwhelming, and even despite a rather misleading introduction, as opening track A Beast Among Us actively chooses not to immediately batter you over the head, opting for a more typical death doom approach with all the gloom, ooze, and menace that you would suspect of this genre. A blatant attempt to fool and shock inexperienced listeners before eventually stretching its wings and revealing its grand ambition and intelligence. As gloomy and almost sludgy passages of bold riffs dominate the forefront of the sound, weaving in and out of some explosive extreme crescendos and some powerful vocal assaults, ending on a particularly ambient and ominous section that would not feel out of place on some kind of horror soundtrack. And from there on, Temple of Void, undeterred and simply hoping that you're along for the ride at this point, lets their ooze-covered freak flag fly, getting more expansive, more experimental, and more dramatic as the album continues to go. Like on the melancholic and mentally taxing Leave the Light Behind, pulling from the worlds of post-metal and gothic metal with its flickering guitars and lush and dramatic vocal harmonies. Or on the truly disgusting, shape-shifting death metal monster of Casket of Shame, initially borrowing from some of the more groovy and progressive twists and turns of early 90s Morbid Angel before adopting some more angular riffs that bring to mind some of the more obscure material from bands like the Melvins and Alice in Chains. Winding up, in my opinion, as not just the heaviest track on the record, but the most interesting and unpredictable as well. With all of these ideas and concepts coming together on the explosive catharsis of closing track The World That Was. A progressive, multifaceted, 9.5-minute death doom monster that, despite its weight, despite its length, manages to completely retain my attention from start to finish. Which is a particularly impressive feat when you consider that I am infamously somewhat impatient when it comes to songs exactly like this. They've even managed to do something I've always argued is somewhat impossible via the interlude A Single Obulus. They've managed to construct an interlude that actually emotionally and atmospherically ties into the record and doesn't exist simply to provide breathing room or to make the band seem smarter than they actually are. To put it very simply, it's a damn good track with this beautiful, warm, almost flamenco kind of guitar that reminds me a lot of Black Sabbath's Laguna Sunrise, but a lot more in tune with the concept of this album. Bravo, Temple of Void, and to every extreme metal band out there that feels the need to have intros and interludes all over your fucking record, don't bother unless you've heard this. Please, just don't bother. There's a certain eagerness and confidence consistently displayed through this record that itself is downright infectious, and it makes everything so much better. It guides the album, it builds it from the very core. It is the reason that everything on this album succeeds as it does. And it makes me so excited not just to continue exploring this record, but to continue exploring Temple of Void in the future. I mean, this feels like the stepping stone for some seriously insane shit. With this in mind, I'm going to give this a 4.5 out of 5. This is really an incredible record. The songwriting, the performances, the incredible balance of lavish and cinematic tones with the inherently brutal and slimy mix. The only criticism I can really contribute to this is that I wish that the rougher, more extreme vocals were themselves a little bit more dynamic. They do kind of fall into that category of being these typical Cookie Monster gutturals. With this in mind, though, I almost have to concede that this is just a part of the death metal genre at this point. Even some of Temple of Void's most creative peers fall victim to this exact same thing. Take my homeboys here in Toronto, Tumult, for example. And it's not as if it detracts per se from the emotional and sonic experience of this record. It still feels so big, so bold, so dynamic, so ambitious, so powerful. Highly, 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 highly fucking recommend this. This is easily the most exciting and interesting death metal I have heard in 2020. No disrespect to any of the bands that we've name dropped so far, but it just is. It just is. For me, at least. A perfect album to look out for if you're looking for something a little bit more progressive and, dare I say, beautiful in your extreme metal without wanting to compromise, well, you know, the extremity. And I honestly wouldn't have much of a problem recommending this to a newcomer as well. In fact, I'll even argue right now, this album, perhaps unintentionally, but nonetheless, acts quite perfectly as this smorgasbordian entry point for newcomers, pulling from all of these different places, pulling from all of these different sub-genres, and combining them into one platter that still feels quite digestible, even if it initially seems very overbearing. Ultimately, it's just an album that y'all need to listen to from a band that y'all seriously need to start paying attention to if you aren't already. 4.5 out of 5, an incredible record. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately, and you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.